Well, first, Elisa is going to give us her speech. Elisa Servin is a research professor of Mexican history and National Institute of Anthropology and History. We call it INAH, Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia. She has authored and edited several books. Among them are Rupture and Opposition, The Political Opposition and Crisis, Reform and Revolution in Mexico. So please welcome Elisa Servin.
Good morning. I think I'll put the city. Well, I would like to hold the mic. Can you hear? Yeah. I would like to start with a brief historical context, a brief historical reminder of what has been going on in the last few years to understand what happened in this last election. What's the historical significance of AMLO's victory? I would say briefly that after 30 or 40 years of struggle for democracy, the electoral left, the let's say political left, the progressives, they win the presidency by a huge margin, as well as a majority in Congress, both in Cámara de Senadores and Cámara de Diputados. They win 5 governorships of 8 in dispute, and the majority in a lot of local legislatures.
Volume needs to turn the volume up on the system.
Where's the
Well, open to it.
I don't know.
Talk right into the front of it. I can shout.
Just talk right into the mic.
Like this? Oh,
Yeah.
why not? It's complicated. Okay. In any case, he wins everything, or almost everything. He wins the election almost in every state except for beautiful Guanajuato. And he, as I said, he has Congress, he has a lot of local state legislatures, and his party, Morena, wins el Senado and Cámara de Diputados. He wins, everybody I guess knows by now, he has 63, in an election that has almost 64% of participation. He gets 53, almost 54% of the presidential vote, which is a huge margin between him and his next competitor, Anaya from Partido Acción Nacional. For AMLO and Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador, this is like the culmination of a 12 years effort to win the presidency in order to fulfill a progressive social agenda. In 2006, it's the first time he competes for the presidency as the candidate of the PRD, Partido de la Revolución Democrática. He loses, he's defeated in the election, but by a narrow margin of 0.56% by Felipe Calderón, the candidate of Partido Acción Nacional. The fact that the defeat is by such a narrow margin and there are many clues to think about fraud makes him engage in a huge resistance campaign against fraud. He occupies Avenida Reforma, one of the main avenues in Mexico City. He proclaims himself the legitimate president, and he starts through this sort of resistance campaign, he starts the fight for the next election. With the help of the PRI, Calderón begins his presidency fighting this huge resistance movement, and from that moment on, everybody starts talking about the PRIAN, that's the PRI plus the PAN. In 2012, AMLO is defeated again, this time by Enrique Peña Nieto, by Televisa, the main media corporation, and by the PRI, who literally buy the election and benefit from the anger and the discontent that Calderón's war on drugs has generated. Calderón's presidency leaves hundreds of thousands of mostly young Mexicans dead or disappeared, and the PRI can capitalize on that, saying, okay, we're going to impose order again. Again, AMLO is defeated. This time it's less, the margin is a little bit higher, so no more presidencia legítima. But by this moment, it is very clear that he's not in agreement with what the PRD is doing. Peña Nieto begins his government with a Pacto por México, and what he signs with PAN, PRI, and PRD, this Pacto, which will allow him to start a new wave of structural economic reforms. The fact that the PRD is signing that Pacto and is willing to cooperate with Peña Nieto sort of opens an exit for Lopez Obrador, who is, of course, very strongly critical of the PRD. He accuses them of betraying what the left has been fighting for, and since then he starts in the process of building a new sort of electoral structure. In 2014, that's 2 years after, Morena is born. Morena, which means Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, National Regeneration Movement, is AMLO's new electoral structure. And Morena is, in a way, the beneficiary and, I would say, the inheritor of all the social struggles, political and electoral struggles of the left. At that point, it's becoming more clear and clear that the PRD is not what used to be. Many people have deserted the PRD because of his alliance with Peña Nieto, and offers a way out. Morena is conceived as a movement, not as a political party. From the beginning, Lopez Obrador is clear he's clear in the sense that Morena is a movement that wants to bring everybody in, but at the same time, it's obviously it's a new structure. It's a new electoral structure that's being created to prepare the third election for AMLO. Since 2012 and, well, 2012, 2014, AMLO has been traveling all throughout the country, organizing, talking to people, creating local committees of Morena, creating all kinds of, building all kinds of alliances. And as soon as the new presidential campaign begins at the end of 2017, Lopez Obrador becomes the candidate of Morena. No surprise there. What happens in 2018? After 12 years of PRIAN, or even 18, if we take into account Fox government from 2000 to 2006, AMLO offers a new kind of, he has a new proposal. He is a well-known politician that offers honesty instead of corruption, that offers peace and negotiation instead of violence and repression, that offers economic growth and development instead of stagnation. Even though his personality is quite polarizing, some people love him, some people hate him, I think that the need for change is bigger than anything else. People who didn't vote for him in 2006 or 2012 are willing to vote for him in 2018. They decide to give him a chance, and a lot of, I mean, people just on the streets, or I've heard that many times. People say, we gave PAN a chance, we gave PRI a second chance, it didn't work, we have to give Lopez Obrador a chance. In that sense, the election is a rejection of PRIAN governments, but it's also a rejection of violence, a rejection of corruption, of impunity, and of economic stagnation. For me, the big paradox of this election is that even though it's a win for the left, it's a win for those who have fought against the Mexican political system throughout, I don't know, the second half of the 20th century. The big paradox is that AMLO's triumph in a way reconstitutes this Mexican political system. The fact, I mean, the way he won, the way Morena won, brings us to having a strong president at the top of the system, whose party has a majority in Congress, and as well as in many state legislatures, which eventually would allow him to reform the Constitution. AMLO controls his party, Morena, the way former presidents used to control El PRI. So the big question is, to what extent this huge power will serve a different agenda. in order to win the election, AMLO built a huge network of political allies throughout the country. It includes not only people from the left, but also people from the right. It includes former panistas, evangelicals, of course, lots of former priistas, perredistas, and the question is, to what extent can this broad alliance of different political agendas, to what extent that can fulfill transformation, a radical transformation in Mexico. For instance, his proposed cabinet has as a leading figure a businessman from Monterrey, Alfonso Romo, who AMLO has proposed as his next chief of staff. Romo has been very, very explicit, very open about the fact that they are not willing to engage in a radical transformation, that they are not willing to sort of fight or have confrontations with financial elites, not here or in global terms. And I mean, he's right now, it looks like he's the right-hand man of Lopez Obrador. With Romo, there are also a group of economistas, well, this is logical, who are also very interested in keeping economic stability. It was, I think, very revealing that the first thing AMLO did after winning the presidency was to meet with the main business chambers, the main business groups who were, up to one day before, they were completely critical of Lopez Obrador. One day after, they were all hugging and kissing each other and saying, oh yes, we're going to come together and fight for Mexico. Okay. There's also a group of former colaboradores de AMLO when he was Mexico City's mayor. People like Marcelo Ebrard, who now he's proposing to be his foreign affairs minister. Among the, I don't know how to say this well, Ebrard, when he was mayor of Mexico City as well, after AMLO brought Giuliani to Mexico City to sort of learn from him how to control and how to make a big city work in peace. He's also, he has someone like Alfonso Durazo, who was Vicente Fox's spokesman, as his new Secretario de Seguridad Pública. And I'm telling this because it really doesn't look like that would be a left progressive sort of government. On the other hand, he has, as in his proposed cabinet, he has people who have a long history of social organizing. For instance, his proposal for the Secretaría de Desarrollo Social is a woman, she's a scholar, she's an academic who has been working many years in community organizing. So in that sense, really, for me, it's an open question. Who, in this sort of broad mixture of people from all sort of backgrounds, who will eventually impose or win in terms of political agenda. On the other hand, there are huge expectations from everybody. I mean, everybody has something to expect from AMLO, particularly his promises to redistribute wealth, fight social inequality, and among everything else, fight corruption. Yesterday, well, in September 1st, a new Congress will be, the Congress will be installed, and already yesterday they announced the 12 proposals that AMLO is sending to Congress in order to be discussed and eventually approved. Among those initiatives, he's mentioning rolling back, for instance, the water decrees that Peña Nieto proposed just a few months ago. He's proposing to modify the education reform, who was very controversial, reduce salaries at the top for top bureaucrats, including the president himself, end huge pensions to former presidents, and nothing so far about reversing the energetic reform. So, I mean, I have to say that when I heard him say, like, okay, I'm sending these initiatives to Congress, and Congress will decide, it kind of reminded me of when the presidents the former president said, okay, Congress will decide, but, you know, by the way, my party has majority in Congress. So for me, really, this is an open question to what extent he and his government and his way of doing politics will make a difference. I mean, by now, everybody is willing to do whatever AMLO is interested in asking them to do. By now, I mean, one of the key questions is what are the counterweights? Who's going to sort of balance this sort of strong power? To what extent will he and his government face opposition, and where is it going to come from, given the fact that PAN and PRI are basically knocked out, especially PRI. So who's going to lead opposition in case there are things that need to be opposed? I would briefly mention perhaps a new a new citizenship that it's more, that it's very informed, that it's willing to sort of have accountability towards this government. Of course, social media it's the new element that everybody's talking about. To what extent social media can sort of create a contrast or sort of a reminder of the things he offered in case he's not willing to comply. And of course, the big actors, business, man, the army, and global actors like financial institutions or, of course, other governments. I'm not mentioning Trump yet. The last thing I want to say is that, and it has been very interesting. He's not yet president-elect. No one has given him. He hasn't got from Instituto Electoral the constancia that says you win the election, you are the president-elect. So far, he is the virtual president-elect. However, he's the main political actor in Mexico today. He's every day on the press. He's the one who's sort of defining the political agenda. Peña Nieto seems to have sort of vanished, and I think that the White House has sort of realized this and is willing to comply with it. Just thinking about the delegation that is going to meet with AMLO tomorrow after talking to Peña Nieto. That's Pompeo from State Department, Mnuchin, Nielsen, and of course, last but not least, Jared Kushner. This is I mean, this is like a huge delegation that after visiting Peña Nieto and talking with him, will immediately go to AMLO's offices to sort of pay him a courtesy visit. For me, this is really very interesting of how everybody's sort of like willing to collaborate and get to know each other. So, I mean, I would leave it here, and we can go back to questions.
Well, the question session will be after Laura's speech, if you don't mind. So let me introduce you to Laura Carlsen. I'm sure most of you already know her. He's a frequent visitor to this city. So, based in Mexico City, Laura Carlsen's American program is a major source of news and commentary on Mexico and Latin America for English readers. Well, his website is americas.org. Her print and broadcast reportage has been featured by Democracy Now!, Pacifica Radio, The New York Times, Washington Post, Huffington Post, BBC, and CNN. She's host of the weekly television show Interviews from Mexico from Telesur. Telesur. Okay, so please welcome Laura.
Well, thank you once again for inviting me. It's always a pleasure, and especially to open up this discussion on these fascinating times that we're living through right now. Before I started on some of the questions, because what I'd like to get to is Cliff sent a list of questions that might be on people's mind regarding what's happening now. I wanted to just tell you briefly about the electoral observation mission that we just finished doing. And because I think it has a lot to do with many of the issues that Elisa was talking about, and also with kind of what we're seeing now and what we saw on July 1st and beforehand that brought us to this day. We began in February organizing an electoral mission, and at that time there was a lot of concern about fraud. For the reasons that Elisa mentioned, that there was a long history of fraud, 2 elections stolen that completely changed the course and the development of Mexican history. And that could have changed again at this very critical point when we had a very strong force for change growing up within the country before the July 1st elections. So we got together, and there was a seminar that was organized by the National Autonomous University, the INAH. People came in from other countries, and a lot of people from the United States, from Europe. And after that, formed the Scholars and Citizens Network for Democracy in Mexico. One of the first things we did was to write a letter signed by 150 U.S. scholars to members of the U.S. Congress, basically saying, stay out of this. There was also a very big concern at that time. There were high-level members of the Trump administration who were saying openly to the press, we do not want to see Lopez Obrador presidency in Mexico. We saw this as a red flag, obviously. If that's being said openly, you can figure that it's a tip of the regime change iceberg. And there was a lot of fear that the democracy promotion programs, or so-called, would be set into motion to prevent the popular will from prevailing in a Mexican election where it looked like, for the first time in decades, if not ever in the modern history of the country, a left-of-center candidate was going to win. So we got that letter out, we talked to members of Congress, and then we put out a call for foreign observers. And the response was overwhelming. The goal of a project that we had was to have about 20 to 30 foreign observers and 70 national, and we ended up managing a group of 100 foreign observers and 200 national observers. The observation was utter chaos, as you can probably imagine, but it was also kind of magical because it was an incredible group of people with a strong feeling that what happened in Mexico mattered to them, not just because they were scholars or academics who studied Mexico, but many of them because they were working for democracy in their parts of the world and had followed the course of democracy, or the course of not quite making it to democracy in Mexico for a long time. So there were people who belonged to migrant organizations in the United States, progressive churches, as well as the scholars networks, other types of grassroots organizations throughout Latin America. We concentrate on 4 states in the center of the country, Mexico City, State of Mexico, Puebla, and Morelos, and ended up forming about 30 brigades that covered 250 polling places on election days and circuits that went out from different routes in those 4 areas, as well as special missions in Veracruz, in Tlaxcala, and contacts in other states throughout the country. So to just briefly describe what some of the conclusions of that process were, everyone had a different experience. Some had a very peaceful day, others were up against a lot of the same mechanisms of fraud that we've seen in elections in the past. But overall, the conclusions were pretty much the same. First of all, that there was a very high rate of participation. If you look at it percentage-wise, it's not among the highest in the history of Mexican elections. However, if you look at it in terms of sheer numbers, 46 million people who came out to vote, it's by far the highest. And of course, it's by far the highest that ever voted for one person. This is because like over 15 million youth were added to the electoral rolls in this election, and they made a huge difference at the time of voting. What we also saw was a really strong commitment on the part of people to vote. They would say, if we'd asked them, that they felt like it's their obligation, and on the other hand, that they were voting for a change. So it was both because of the candidate, and it was really the candidate, and this possibility of a change that triggered a kind of a civic awakening. Because it wasn't, the vote in Mexico has been pretty meaningless to people for a long time. You have 70 years of one-party rule, in which elections are basically a ritual to maintain the powers that be, not to renovate them. And it comes to the point where people think, well, you know, if somebody's going to give me 2 kilos of rice and a kilo of beans and some oil and stuff, then I might as well feed my family, because this vote really is not going to change my life. And something changed in this election that made vote buying still a common practice, but many people less willing to sell their vote and more determined to exercise it in a free way. So we were very impressed by the commitment and that sense of a real democracy, which also represented a pretty big change for Mexican political culture. The other was that although it didn't prevail, that doesn't mean that the mechanisms for fraud were dismantled, or somehow that the parties, the powers that be, said, okay, we're stepping back, we're not even going to mess with this election. That's not the case. Especially in the state of Mexico, especially in Puebla, we're still seeing it now, what happened there with the PAN and the governorship. And there's a number of other places in Coyoacán with the PRD There were real hotspots in this elections, and there was widespread evidence of using social programs to coerce the vote, Salario Rosa, which is the pink wage for housewives, Prospera, which is the largest social program. Even before the elections, we knew that this was going on and that this was continuing to be a practice. But by the time we got to the elections, there was a lot of pressure that had already been removed, because with a 20 to 30 point lead, it was pretty obvious that they couldn't flip it. It's pretty much impossible, if you have any need whatsoever to maintain a facade of democracy, to steal an election in which the opposing candidate has a 20 to 30% lead. Nobody in the world, and much less in your own country, is gonna believe it. And not only that, but this base of support for Lopez Obrador is a mobilized and a tough base of support. I remember at the closing campaign rally, there's an image that sticks in my mind that the stadium was filling up slowly, because apparently they were just like letting people trickle in from outside. It's filling up slowly, and there were a bunch of chairs in the midsection. And so some women marched down and they said, we want to sit there. And the Lopez Obrador people said, well, you can't, that's for special guests. They said, we are special guests, and just elbowed their way through, you know? It's going to be interesting. If he doesn't make room for these people, he's going to be subject to some serious elbowing. And I think when we talk about, you know, checks on presidential power or pressures to move this movement in the direction that a lot of people wanted to see it go, one of the big ones is going to be from the citizenry itself, but it's going to depend a lot on their capacity to maintain mobilization and to channel that into specific demands, and also on the capacity and the willingness of the government to really open up these spaces of inclusion that they've talked about, but that we have to see how they'll actually play out as things move along. So that was the experience. There was, like I say, there was a lot of fraud. It didn't make a difference, but one of the other main, I guess, impressions that people came out with was that this was a big deal, not just for Mexico, but also for the rest of the world. I mean, people were very excited about it. It was a nonpartisan electoral observation mission. But the fact that in a country that had been so controlled in terms of elections for so long, this could take place with a significant change in the political and economic model, and we'll talk a little bit more about both the limits and the possibilities to those changes. You know, the fact that that could take place and that people were so willing to really get involved, whether they were poll watchers or observers or voters themselves who stood for hours under the sun just to be able to vote, but to really get involved to defend democracy, has been an inspiration, certainly for everyone who was involved in the elections observation, and for many people who weren't as well. So as we look at some of these questions, let me just call them up here. You know, they're big questions, and I certainly don't have all the answers. I did have the opportunity in the run-up to the elections, as well as taking part with the observer groups, to interview a large number of electoral experts and political analysts about what this could mean, and including people within the Lopez Obrador campaign and people who have seen that long history of a struggle for democracy that Elisa was describing. So I have the benefit of reflecting here some of their views while not being an expert in electoral politics itself. In fact, as many of you know, we've usually worked from the side of the grassroots movements. And what happened, just another aside, in this election in particular, and the reason that the Americas program became involved in coordinating the international observers part of it, was that it became so clear that a huge part of including the grassroots movements that we've traditionally worked with and worked alongside was placing their hopes, their aspirations, and their expectations for change in the electoral process. And so we made a decision within the program to say, okay, if so many people believe that this is an avenue for change, we have a responsibility at least to defend their vote and to do everything we can so that when they exercise that vote, whether it turns out to be the avenue for change or not, they can do it freely and fairly, and they can be represented on election day and in the results. And that's how we became involved in it. So the first question here is, what are some of the major challenges that AMLO and Morena will face as they seek to carry out their agenda? We've touched on some of those major challenges. First of all, there's the fact that there's a very broad coalition. If you look at the cabinet that was announced, of course, months before the election itself, so that people would have a sense of what kind of government they were voting for, you see this kind of disparity between Romo, businessman, conservative, and the PACE party, the evangelicals, and basically anti-women's rights platform, and the people who have traditionally been building grassroots movements and been building the left in Mexico. So it's a wide range. It's not the first time we've seen that when a government comes in like this. We saw it with Lula, and it's difficult. We can see what's happening now in Brazil as a result of that in many ways. So it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge. Lopez Obrador seems to be convinced that because the positions of the party have been announced well beforehand and have been discussed with grassroots movements and with much of the base. As you know, it was a campaign that instead of putting everything in Televisa or in the mass media, was really a door-to-door campaign. It was really a village-to-village campaign. So that's again why we have a greater degree of consensus on some of these positions and a greater degree of popular support to carry them out. So he seems to be convinced that he can hold this together, but it's a big question mark. It's certainly not a question that I can answer, and it's certainly going to be one of the challenges as he moves forward to actually govern. If an example might be, for example, just to reflect both the tensions and possible ways that they're going to be dealt with. As the Secretary of Agriculture, the appointment is Victor Villalobos. Victor Villalobos is a businessman, and as well as the ones that Elisa was mentioning, so this is the right wing of the cabinet. He's a businessman, and not only that, he's been very close to Monsanto and the promotion of genetically modified organisms in the countryside. Well, that is particularly the nodal point of grassroots organizing among small farmers organizations for like the past 25 years against the use of genetically modified organisms, particularly corn, in the Mexican countryside. And they've been fighting back against Monsanto that never quits pressuring on that for years and years. And so they were poised to support Lopez Obrador, to support his promises to reinvigorate the countryside, to create a rural development plan that would take into account the value of food sovereignty and many of the other pillars of their movement. And then they get this. At first it was like a bucket of cold water. It was a huge betrayal to their expectations. And after much discussion, the organizations that are organized in what's called now the Plan de Ayala 21st Century decided to support Lopez Obrador. They got Lopez Obrador to sign their platform of change in the countryside, and they suspended not the objections to the Secretary of Agriculture, but at least the head-on fight against him until after the election. Now, at the same time, we've seen the Secretary of Agriculture, the appointee, coming out and saying that he will not be promoting genetically modified organisms in the countryside. So I think this is the kind of negotiations we're going to be seeing as we go forward. Now, the other major challenge to this agenda will be the system, whatever you want to call it. You know, we saw such a trouncing of both the PRI and the PAN in this election, and then we also saw this kind of stepping back from fighting for it, from going all out to try to keep Lopez Obrador from reaching the presidency. That many people are, I think, prematurely considering that they've become politically marginalized. And they're certainly not politically marginalized, although their sphere of activity in the formal sphere is limited, and they're certainly not economically marginalized. I mean, these are two parties who have governed to create economic and financial empires out of the natural resources of Mexico that they've consolidated over decades of ruling and looting the country. They have a huge amount of economic power. The other night we were talking about this in the Club de Periodistas. And I said, well, I think what they've done is just change from a strategy of Mapache to a strategy of Tlacuache. Okay, so Mapache is an operator of political fraud. The Mapaches were the ones who carried out the fraud, all those kinds of practices like stuffing ballot boxes and selling the vote, and they have it refined to a science, right? Those are the Mapaches, and that's what we saw, but on a very limited basis, and not so much in the presidential campaign as in the local and state campaigns. A Tlacuache is a possum. When it's under attack, it plays dead, but it's not dead. And as soon as you think it's dead, it comes back to the attack. So that's probably what we're looking at right now. And everybody's all lovey-dovey, you know, everybody's like Peña Nieto con Lopez Obrador, and the business class is putting out their videos just 2 days after sending, I got a call on election day, you know, practically, if you vote for Lopez Obrador, the world will end, you know.
The world.
Yeah, that's what, you know, they had variations on the message, but that was essentially it. And now they're putting out these videos like, we can live with this, you know. So they'll be back. They'll be working to sabotage, especially the most progressive proposals that he has. The other question is how coherent is Morena as a political force, and we talked a little about that. And then it says, is there a danger that opportunists will flock to it as they abandon pre-plan and PRD and end up corrupting it? Well, they already have, first of all. You know, when you look at local, if you have to fill, this was an election that had more than 18,000 posts up for grabs. Biggest election in Mexican history. And if you have to fill with candidates that many posts, they're filling it with people who can win. And in many local elections and state elections, they're filling it with people who can win, who've come directly from other parties, and who really don't share this platform that Lopez Obrador ran on. So that's going to be another huge challenge. Do PRI-PAN and PRD have a future? Yes, yes, and no. PRI and PAN have a future. The PRI will not let go. It's been building up this power forever, you know, in terms of the political history of the country. The PAN is filling the space of a socially conservative, neoliberal party on the right that it will continue to fill, and the PRD is reduced to pretty much nothing. In fact, if you do a careful analysis of the election results, the PRD should lose its registration as a party. Right now they've gotten rid of INAH and PACE, the evangelical party, but if it goes any further and if there's a real kind of investigation into this, they should lose it too. They got less than 3% of the vote. And they've already seen a mass exodus of their members, mostly to Morena, before the elections even started. Now, The ALMO's program, we mentioned to revitalize the countryside and what does it mean for NAFTA. A lot of the pillars of that program come straight from the peasants' movement. They include food sovereignty, they include supports for national production, they include limits on imports in order to protect national production, and also the state first providing a market for what's produced within the country before importing, especially from the United States. So there's a number of precepts there that actually go against NAFTA. And in fact, the University of Chapingo, the agricultural university, has openly suggested that agriculture and food be removed from NAFTA as strategically important sectors. So far, what the Lopez Obrador team has said is that they'll maintain the same negotiation positions on NAFTA. So we've got a contradiction there, an open contradiction, and nobody knows exactly how it will be resolved. They're asking that in the platform itself, they're not saying to pull out of NAFTA, but they're asking that everything that contradicts a food sovereignty and right to food, which is in the Mexican Constitution, should be taken out of NAFTA, and that NAFTA should be negotiated in the context of national development, not free trade, and that migration should be incorporated. Labor and mobility and the rights of migrants should be incorporated. Obviously, for a Trump administration, these are deal breakers. So you might as well just say, let's get rid of NAFTA. And again, since they're not coming up in Jesus Seade's platform for negotiation, it's not clear how the new administration would reconcile its commitments to the peasant organizations and its NAFTA position so far, which are seemingly contradictory. In the face of looming financial crisis or fiscal crisis, will AMLO be able to fund the social programs for the poor? Obviously, I can't answer this question. I'm one who actually does believe, however, that the statement that you can fund a great deal of these programs out of eliminating corruption is not as far-fetched as it may sound. First of all, because we already have massive funding for social programs. For social programs that are clientelist or clientele-oriented, for social programs that are ineffective, and for social programs that end up in great part in the pockets of contractors and politicians. So if you actually made the funding for those same social programs retooled, effective, and really directed toward the people who needed them, you could already go a long ways. If you add to that the funding that comes in from the austerity measures and the anti-corruption measures that they're talking about, and these measures theoretically could be applied like practically overnight. If you begin to actually prosecute people for corruption, something that has not been done, even at high levels, and you send out this message that this isn't going to happen anymore, even corruption is deeply ingrained in the political system as it is in Mexico, could be turned around, I think, in a fairly short term, although it would meet with a great deal of resistance. Now let's look at those. We talked a little about the 12 points that just came out yesterday. It has to do with this question about the neoliberal reforms. They're looking at the contracts at this stage in the energy reform. That didn't come out in the 12 points, but there was a recent interview with the person who will be, the woman who will be the Secretary of Energy. The education reform was reiterated in the 12 points, that it will be modified or annulled, that there'll be an analysis with the Secretary of Education. It seems to be a pretty strong point against the current education reform. One of the 12 points is the immediate annulment of the water privatization decree. So there's no ambiguity about that, and I know that here in San Miguel de Allende, this is a critical issue, as it is for many, many parts of the country. the 12 points don't really look at labor flexibilization, but they do look at minimum wage and reducing the both minimum wage and special wage on the border area, which is part of a plan to create development, reduce migration, and the overall minimum wage, and then reducing the salaries, as was mentioned. To close, I think the Latin American advisor of the Inter-American Dialogue, which is a pretty mainstream organization in the United States, asked for 250 words on the impact on the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And basically, first of all, I think you have to understand there was a lot of dire warnings, many of you saw these in the press, that electing Lopez Obrador would torpedo the U.S.-Mexico relationship, which frankly couldn't get much worse short of open warfare, right? But there were these dire warnings anyway. Now the people who made the dire warnings, like the business people, are saying, oh, well, Lopez Obrador is going to make some changes and nobody has to worry, and we're really his friends. Everybody likes to jump on the bandwagon of power, and especially power with a mandate like that. So in terms of the two getting along, and then you have this, this strange reaction or unexpected reaction on the part of Donald Trump to immediately be one of the first to recognize, send down his highest level, representatives to congratulate or to talk or make the first contact with Lopez Obrador. And I think that has to do also with this infantile mentality of winners and losers that Donald Trump has, and he saw obviously Peña Nieto as a loser and sees Lopez Obrador as a winner. So he's got a little bit more respect in that way, which could curb the invective, which in itself is a good thing for the relationship. To actually be friends with Donald Trump is really the kiss of death in any concept of diplomacy. So I don't think that we can really expect this. But the interesting thing is that we have to measure this relationship not between how well the presidents are going to get along, but in terms of what the good is for the people. And if we look at some of these positions, we can see a much, much better U.S.-Mexico relationship than what we've seen in the past. If there's a turn away from the war on drugs and the Merida Initiative is eliminated, and instead there's a focus on development and going to the root causes, we have less violence, we have less pressure on migration, and we eliminate two of the major sources, or really justifications, for the wall and the militarization and the hate speech that's coming out in the United States. That would be a win-win for the populations. Then if we went into NAFTA and we took the points of agreement that they have, raising wages in Mexico, again, we have a situation where it's better off, where Mexican workers are better off, US workers are better off, the Mexican market, internal market, is revitalized. Mexico has a chance of diversifying its economic relations, less dependency on the United States, and we get to a closer and more equitable and more symmetrical level of diplomacy again. So there's a number of examples like that in which I really believe that there could be a better relationship between the two countries, even if, and especially if, Lopez Obrador stands up to the United States and its agenda of hegemony and bullying toward Mexico, as well as outright insults that's characterized the relationship in the past. Thanks.
Okay, so many topics we have to discuss about, but anyways, the question session is open if you're willing to. Okay, please.
Did you say that Guanajuato did not, the state of Guanajuato did not vote for him? And why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, the answer, why not, because this is the PAN stronghold. And historically, Guanajuato has, I mean, it's a conservative state historically, and I think that even though Morena grew immensely in Guanajuato, I mean, I think they were able to have the second. I mean, they displaced the PRI in certain areas of the state. Really, the PAN, the Partido Acción Nacional, has a lot of control in regional state control in Guanajuato. So I think that's basically. I mean, when they started sort of looking at polls and watching how this was going to be a disaster, I guess they put a lot of effort in keeping the state of Guanajuato, plus mentality and political culture, and I would have been very, very surprised if Lopez Obrador had won in Guanajuato, because really this is a state where people are completely, and they are sort of proud of being anti-left and anti, well, I was thinking about even in sort of classista terms, something that just came up to my mind. I mean, this is also a very interesting election in terms of regional politics and in terms of how the center and the south of the country is portrayed as less developed, more Indian, more poor, poorer, whatever, and the north of the country is developed, it's modern, it has all the business investments. So the fact that someone who is pretty dark-skinned has a sort of worker class background, lived with the Mayas for I don't know how many years when he was beginning his political career. The fact that someone that comes from the South can win the election, it's a big, I think it's a big step in terms of the sort of cultural framework. In that sense, Guanajuato is proud of, well, I'm saying Guanajuato, of course, it's all kinds of people in Guanajuato, but there's a strong sort of Hispanista background. A lot of people are proud of the fact that the Spanish people lived here and they built mines and they had huge haciendas. I mean, in San Miguel you can see how explicit this sort of Hispanista background is people are proud of that. So, I mean, I guess that's, and it also has a lot to do with what Laura was mentioning. I mean, there were a lot of social programs that had been developed by local governments or state governments that were put into action in order to buy or control votes. As she explained, in a lot of places, I think what happened was that people who already had committed their votes for PRI or PAN, in the end, I guess just being in the ballot box, they said, no way. I mean, this is an act of pride, and I'm going to vote for the one I really want to vote. But here in Guanajuato, I mean, The paradox is that it's one of the poorest states in Mexico. It's one of the less educated states. I mean, people are really, there's a huge migration to the states, which has to do with, it's not a highly developed state in economic terms. So, and of course, the church has a lot of control in one of it. I don't know to what extent the fact that Lopez Obrador is I think he's an evangelical, he's a Christian, not a Catholic. I don't know to what extent that also had something to do first.
Next question, please.
Oh, down there?
And three. Okay. Yes, please.
Has the new government talked about policies toward the refugees coming up from Central America and how they're going to deal with the deportees from the United States that's different from what's been happening?
Okay.
Anybody?
We're going to take your question, the other one, and the third one, in order to respond to these three questions. So please.
My question was about, it's a little complicated because it has to do with corruption and with crime and cartels, and not so much the drugs, but the cartel control. I haven't seen Lopez Obrador's plan on that. I mean, little bits and pieces, but you know, the judiciary has to do with the police, you know, the bribing of the officials, all that sort of thing.
Yes, sir.
Has Lopez Obrador spoken specifically about Ayotzinapa, if he intends to address that issue?
Sorry about the shoes, I forgot to bring that was sort of unintentional. It's interesting, it's going to be a really delicate issue. Right now, in this delegation that's coming up from the United States, or coming down, some of them, it turns out that Nielsen's coming up because she was just, the Homeland Security was just in Guatemala, where they're talking about immigration, of course, and what has to be done. What Lopez Obrador has said is sort of the same as here, that it has to do with root causes, and that what they want is a regional development plan that will eliminate forced migration so that migration can be a choice, and that will reduce migratory, pressures from Central America up through here, and that will, but at the same time that there'll be a respect for the rights of migrants. What Homeland Security is going to ask Mexico is that they're insisting now that asylum be in the first safe country. And that means that Mexico must receive all Central American asylum claims, that they shouldn't even be allowed to get to the United States. I don't know what's going to happen with this. It's kind of tricky because on the one hand, there's the immediate response of why are we doing your dirty work, but on the other hand, granting asylum to refugees is not dirty work. Mexico should be granting asylum to refugees anyway. So basically, they're going to be putting that emphasis on, on the root causes. And what they're going to do about the militarization is going to be really the big question. Because we're already deep into Plan Frontera Sur, the southern border plan that the United States funds through the Merida Initiative. They're talking about giving Mexico even more money. Southcom, the Southern Command of the Pentagon, is heavily involved in that effort. It's a complete wrong approach to immigration. And there's going to be tremendous pressure from the Trump administration, not only to maintain it, but to deepen it. So it's not going to be clear what happens there. And as for deportees, I think he's talked about some special development programs in that area as well, welcoming them, of course. Up to now, the government always talks about special development programs for deportees, but there has been very little to nothing for the people who are coming back, and about a more vigorous defense of migrant rights in the United States. In the terms of the cartels, there's been this purposeful vagueness regarding the security policy. In fact, what's been said is that they're going to form a group of victims, leaders of victims organizations like the Movement for Peace with Justice and Dignity, or the Movement of Families of the Disappeared, and experts on security to sit down and forge this policy. What has been announced is very controversial because it just became kind of a flashpoint rather than a policy amnesty proposal, which essentially is, if it turns out to be, if it's defined and refined to be getting out of prison, literally thousands of people who are in there without even having been sentenced yet for minor crimes called delito contra la salud, which is like selling drugs on the corner or something related to that, so that they can really focus on the public safety issues, then it makes a lot of sense. Because we know from the US experience that the war on drugs channeled into the private prison system is a huge injustice and also doesn't work. So there's a lot of elements there that remain to be seen. He's promised a change in the model. But again, a lot of these policies, we can't expect them to be very clearly announced at this point either, because there's a real effort not to rock the boat. You know, even if what he ultimately wants to do is completely change this failed war on drugs policy, he's not going to come out and say it right now because the United States government is going to get the roof. And they've got agents all over the country, and not to mention, you know, troops on the border kind of thing. And the same is true with the neoliberal agenda. I don't know how deep he's willing to go in terms of really changing the neoliberal model, but he's not going to say it now. The first thing he said in the acceptance speech was, we're not going to expropriate, we're going to keep the Bank of Mexico autonomous, we're going to be friends, basically we're going to be friends with the business community. And then after that, you know, all those first messages were directed directly to the international financial community, the markets, the kinds of forces that are invisible, nobody elected them, but that completely sabotage a progressive government. So we're going to have to wait and see on that, because there aren't going to be any radical declarations made until until the government's consolidated a little bit. And finally, Ayotzinapa, what I know is that the announcement of the formation of a truth commission. And there's been some pressure to have an independent commission, like the group of experts or like the CICIG in Guatemala. But that's coming from the Human Rights Commission, organizations, and we don't know yet if that's part of government policy.
I think that regarding refugees and drug cartels, I'm putting those together for one reason. He has emphasized that he's not willing to continue the, let's say, authoritarian, repressive, violent answer to those problems. What he's proposing mainly is development and growth, economic growth. What he says is that both the refugee crisis and the expansion of the drug cartels has to do with poverty, has to do with lack of economic opportunities. So the way to solve those kind of big issues is by attacking the roots of the problem. And then we go back to the economic model and to to what extent is he going to be able, or his government is going to be able to sort of put some pressure on the international financial community and say, okay, stop it, we need to invest and we need to create jobs and we need to ask an answer to this kind of social problems. In that sense, I think that he was very clear when he met with the business people. The next day he won the election, or the second day, I don't know. They agreed, both agreed on the fact that the private sector is a main actor in this, is going to be a main actor in this new government. What he told them basically is, I need your money, so if you are willing to work for Mexico, you're going to have a lot of opportunities, and as long as you invest in Mexico. They talk about a new program that has to do with creating jobs for young people that the government would pay through fiscal, I mean, I don't know really the details, but it has mainly to do with the fact that if creating jobs and that would improve skills for young people who now are just selling drugs or doing whatever they can because they don't have a job, they don't have schools, they don't have anything. So, in a way, this is going back to the Estado benefactor times. The welfare, I don't know if in English it's Estado benefactor is like the welfare state, sort of like bringing back the state as a major social, economic, and political actor, well, economic actor, but also bringing back the private sector to work with the state in order to create a new economy. It doesn't sound too radical. It doesn't sound like socialism or these kind of things. For me, it really sounds more like let's go back to the golden years of the Mexican history when the private sector got a lot of concessions in order to invest and create jobs in Mexico. There is another side of this equation which is rather funny, well, at least he has mentioned something that he calls the Alliance for Progress. I don't know to what extent he knows about what the Alliance for Progress meant in the 60s, but maybe he does, and maybe he's willing to design that sort of a new Alliance for Progress as a way to renew the US-Mexico relations, which would be very interesting. To say, Trump, okay, let's forget about neoliberalism, let's forget about these huge corporations doing whatever they want, let's talk government to government in order to create a new, to invest and create development, particularly in the south of the country. He has been very explicit in the sense that he wants to bring development to Tabasco, Chiapas, the south, the southern areas of the country, which mainly is, it's also where the border with, Central America is, so a way to fight or solve this huge migration would be to create jobs in Chiapas or Tabasco so that people would not have to migrate to the north. To what extent Trump is willing to consider a new alliance for progress, given the fact that he doesn't like Democrats or anything that sounds or smells like Democrats. We don't know. Finally, Ayotzinapa. I think Ayotzinapa is a good example of the kind of issues that are on the table, and really I don't know what's going to happen. Ayotzinapa, it's a tragedy, and it's also a banner of the, let's say, social left. The one that is not willing to compromise in an electoral process, the one that thinks that change has to come from the bottom up and not from the government towards the people, as well as, for instance, the Zapatistas, who just made a declaration about 2 or 3 days ago saying, well, the capataz can change, but the owner of the hacienda is the same. Lopez Obrador was, when he was in a campaign meeting somewhere, I think in Guerrero, he was approached by the padres of the students killed, and they approached him and they wanted to talk to him, and what he said, what he did was he brought them to the stage of the meeting, and he publicly, in front of everybody, made a compromise with them to go to the roots, go to the end of whatever happened in Ayotzinapa. To what extent that can be done, to what extent he's going to go all the way, it's an open question.
Okay, so let's take the last 3 questions, and I would ask you, Peter, if you could pass the we ask you for donations, please, because we have to pay the expenses of the traveling these 2 ladies, please. So we're taking 3 more questions.
On the hat issue. Excuse me. As you all know, I often forget that our program doesn't have any institutional funding. And we've got a lot of huge tasks in front of us. We're going to put out a report on 10 years of the Merit issue and try to get it suspended, and the war on drugs changed by pressuring on both governments. We're going to put out a report on women and extractivism and security issues, and have a book coming up on U.S.-Mexico relations. So we really count on people's support for the program to continue to do this work, because we don't have anything else, to turn to. And we think that this is really probably one of the most important moments in my 30-plus years of being in Mexico and working on U.S.-Mexico relations, to have a voice out there and a space that opens up the pages and the audiences in 2 languages for the voices of many of the sectors that otherwise might be absent from the important debates that are coming up. So please, even a check to the CIP Americas program or whatever you can give will be really appreciated.
Do either of you think there's any prospect for reducing or eliminating the importation of heavily subsidized U.S. crops other than NAFTA or after NAFTA is gone?
If there's a trade war, which they say the first shots have already been fired, negotiating that in the context of NAFTA would be very difficult, because probably, aside from the auto industry, the #1 industry that's pushing back on Trump too, because they feel like he's endangering their excellent market here in Mexico is the corn industry, mostly because of corn syrup, as well as corn imports, but a lot of the corn syrup, which Mexico has tried to control and been slapped down by the NAFTA tribunals and the WTO. I think there is a possibility. The peasant sector is very organized, and of course corn is critical to them. And as I mentioned, they have, one of their tenets is that national production has to find a market before imports can be allowed, which is pretty radical in terms of the last, the free trade model of the last 30 years or so. Exactly how far they'll get with that is a question, but I think that they may actually make some progress.
So, the last question.
Gracias. Me preocupa la falta de claridad de AMLO, específicamente con ciertas cuestiones, por ejemplo, la cuestión de género y violencia de género, que parece que no está necesariamente en la agenda. ¿Podrías comentar un poco de esto?
Bueno, he's asking about the gender agenda. There doesn't seem to be a topic in Lopez Obrador agenda. ¿Entiendes inglés?
Sí.
I think it's interesting, even though he hasn't really talked about it, as far as I remember. It's very interesting that almost half his cabinet are women, and also that, I don't know the number, but like there's a huge amount of women in Congress. I don't know if it's half of the Morena representation or something like that. I mean, a lot of women in AMLO's cabinet and in AMLO's, and in Congress. So, to what extent, and of course, he's proposed a new Secretaria de Gobernación. Is also a woman who apparently is going to have a subsecretaria who's also a woman. So, and as far as I've heard, this new, who could be the new Secretaria de Gobernación, Olga Sánchez Cordero, has a very progressive social agenda. She's already talking about how to say euthanasia. I don't know how to say it in English. Euthanasia. Of course, about perhaps legalizing marijuana, which also will have to do with a new policy towards drug cartels. So to what extent this sort of women empowerment in AMLO's government will have an effect on women's issues? Well, also I think it's to be seen, but it sounds like there's going to be some, I mean, that some of the women's issues will be addressed in a different way. I guess that by investing in education, in jobs, etc., perhaps, hopefully, this would help to decrease violence against women. I have to mention there is a historian, a very well-known historian who he has some research done on how in the years before the Mexican independence, that's like the late 18th century, the 17th century, the early 18th century, violence against women increased enormously in the years before the independence war started. and he mentions that there was this sort of patriarchal violence against women rooted in the lack of economic opportunities. So if the man didn't have a job, or his land was stolen, or the capataz beat him, or whatever, he would go home and take that violence towards his family, and particularly women. I'm talking about a 3 sort of centuries ago process that I think could be used to explain the huge amount of violence against women that we are seeing now in Mexico. This sort of, this sort of economic crisis, the impunity, corruption, blah, 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 in the end has a social effect in violence, in domestic violence, in everyday social harassment against women. So if the equation works, perhaps if the economy gets better and young people gets a job and start sort of having more pride, perhaps violence against women will slow down.
I don't agree.
Just very quickly, I'm very concerned about the absence of a women's equality platform in Lopez Obrador's politics. I listen because I don't believe that parity is the same as women's equality. We do have a Congress now that's almost 50% women, not just the Morena people, like you said. The whole Congress is almost 50%. I can't remember the exact, it's like 49, 51 or something. And then and the cabinet as well. But it concerns me that every time with people very close to Morena that I bring up the question of women's equality and violence against women, they say, we have a cabinet that's half women. Wait a minute. You know, and the same thing happened listening to that last speech, which I thought, the closing rally speech, which I thought was a pretty radical speech and laid out, you know, a plan for a country that personally, you know, I could get behind a lot of that. And I listened till the last word of that speech, and I didn't hear the word women or anything that had to do with women, not once. And so I said to somebody, you know, you're talking about a 4th transformation in the history of Mexico, and nobody's talking about women's rights? And they said, well, Claudia Sheinbaum spoke. They really don't get it, you know.